Hello. Yes. Well, good morning. While we get the presentation, yes, that one. Lore, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to Piotr and IBS. It's great to be back in Warsaw. So this presentation will be a little different from the previous ones in the sense of it's not a paper. So I'm not going to present you a paper. What we thought would be useful is maybe to walk you through a little bit on this world of socio-emotional skills, non-cognitive skills, soft skills, life skills, however you want to call them. But not just so much on the importance in the labor market. I mean, there's quite a bit of evidence coming out from different surveys in different countries that they do have a premium. But maybe a little bit of reflection at the beginning on why this may be happening. And I think it's very well connected to the theme of the conference, certainly the issue of the impact of digital technologies on the labor market. And then, basically what can we do about it? And I don't know if there's any psychologists in the room. Great. So think of this as a brief introduction to personality and developmental psychology. I'm not a psychologist myself, so this is what we have learned a little bit working with psychologists. You see, I mean, there's plenty of books, and if you have kids, you either have one of these books or you should go buy them very soon. Okay, so this is the outline. As any, I think we've been taught good presentation is going to be, it's going to have three parts, 3 acts. So first, just a little bit of reflection on definitions. So what are we talking about when we talk about socio-emotional skills? Second, why? Why is it the case that they may be becoming perhaps more important than before? And then third, what can we do about it? In particular, are they malleable? When? By whom? What do we know about interventions? And of course, the known unknowns. So let me start a little bit with this. I mean, it's, again, not I don't have to spend a lot of time, but I mean, the basic question really here is that when we're discussing skills, we're really asking the question, what does it mean to be a well-educated person in the 21st century? It used to be that we proxy skills and human capital by educational level. Well, now we know from evidence from the growth theory, but also micro labor theory, that this is a very imperfect proxy, educational level. So when we're talking about skills, we can talk about different taxonomies. This is the one we kind of like. This distinction between 3 types of skills. The sort of traditional cognitive skills, which basically have to do with the kinds of skills that are measured in PIAC, reading, numeracy, but even higher order, the higher order, your ability to solve novel problems, and even when you go to the neuroscience, things like executive function, working memory, and other things. Then you have the technical, more job-specific skills, which essentially have to do with the skills that are required to do specific tasks in jobs, whether they are manual, or they require thinking. So, either an economist or, let's say, a truck driver. And then you have the socio-emotional. And when we think about the socio-emotional, the way traditionally, I think economists are thinking about it, certainly Gene Heckman, has studied, obviously, this whole literature, is that we focus on observed behaviors. So we essentially looked at what people do. So, whether we see whether people are self-disciplined, organized, they arrive on time, they are reliable, and, show initiative. I mean, all of these things here, they can learn quickly, they work well with others, and also supervise others. And these behaviors matter at school, but certainly we're interested in how they matter in the workplace. Now, what's behind these behaviors? And this is where you need to talk to psychologists. I think for Heckman and for labor economists, it's fine to just measure the behaviors as a proxy of these skills, but in order to be able to do something about it, we need to understand where these behaviors come from. And this is when things start to get foxy, not to say complicated. And if you talk to personality psychologists, you get a story, and if you talk to developmental psychologists, you get another story. So it's, like economies. It comes in different flavors, depending on who you talk to. There is a definition that is more or less well accepted, is from Brent Roberts, which you can read here, in terms of personality. So that's kind of the approach of proxying socio-emotional skills by personality traits. But things are actually a bit more complicated. I mean, there's work that says, well, not everything is personality. There's beliefs, right? Attitudes, even motivation. Motivation is not really a personality trait. In fact, it doesn't really fit very well within the sort of taxonomy of how psychologists think about it. And then you can go down. I mean, the usual personality traits that are kind of well established are the so-called Big Five. You can read, it's called the ocean theory. Openness to experience, which basically means, if you're flexible. Conscientiousness, this is the one that has been established as the more predictive of performance in the workplace. Extroversion, not explanation needed. Agreeableness has to do with how you interact with other people. Emotional stability, how you handle stress. I mean, I'm simplifying because there's no psychologist in the room, so I can take some license. But there are others. I mean, there's in the personality literature, there's people who question the idea that there's only big five, big personality factors. For example, there's a recent study done across several countries which suggests that a sixth factor called honesty is important. And because a lot of the big five research has been done in Anglo-Saxon countries, say in the US, this factor never appears. But it's important in most other places in the world. But when you go down sort of the big five, psychologists talk about facets of personality. And maybe I just go to the next one. Oh, and I should say, there's not a very clear unidirectional link between these. So it's not that you go from, beliefs, personality, facets of personality to behaviors. The fact that they are malleable suggests that if you help people change their behaviors and people behave differently, that then would reflect in changes in personality. And I'll present some evidence to that effect. So let me give you just very quickly one example using this conscientiousness. So, when psychologists have tried to deconstruct this concept, they essentially have established several few factors of, or facets of conscientiousness. And you see them here. So the first one essentially has to do with how well you react to stimulus. So if it's essentially self-control. Maybe I'll just, oops. This on the right-hand side will be the kinds of things we measure. So there are, scales to measure self-control, delaying gratification, self-regulation, et cetera, et cetera. I think what is important here is to distinguish the fact that any of these things actually may matter differently in the labor market. And, look at it and you say, what does it mean formality? Actually, I looked at it. I wasn't quite sure it's any different than, I don't know, conventionality. But in psychology, these things do have a specific meaning. I think, as Glenda said, when we get to the issue of measuring, I mean, even though we have scales, usually self-reported scales to measure many of these things, it is actually quite complicated to implement this in practice in household surveys. So that's the first part, the brief, quick intro on when we talk about socio-emotional skills, what is it we're talking about? Then the next question is, why is it the case that these skills may be somehow more important today? And I'm going to talk about essentially three so-called megatrends that are happening sort of across the world and are impacting labor markets. I kind of like this slide, so it's not quite good for my narrative, but there is one article that I suggest you to read. It came out last week in the New York Times. It's this one, Why What You Learn in Preschool is Crucial at Work. I suggest you read it. Again, if you have children, you may want to buy actually the books that are suggested there. But anywhere there has been an employer survey, employers do tend to say, rank these skills as important as other skills. Now, this graph, I think most of you know, this is coming from the paper by Frey and Osborne, and it's about, sort of projecting into the future what digital technologies may be doing to different types of jobs. What I find interesting, so they distinguish between, the sort of jobs that have a high probability of being automated versus those that are not. On the left-hand side, we have a health education management. Even these actually are, maybe changing very fast. Just about 3-4 months ago, the FDA in the US approved the first robot to administer anesthesia to patients. And this has raised the question of whether now all of a sudden, anesthesiologists who would be here today, all of a sudden, I don't know, in 3, 4, 5 years, may become a redundant occupation. To that, people have said, well, no, because, you still need empathy to do this with people. So what will happen is that anesthesiologists are going to use these robots, and what will happen is that you will need fewer anesthesiologists. So you will still need some, but it's still true that it's going to have an impact even on occupations that today we think are not very easily automated. So that's the first. This graph was already shown. This is coming from the World Development Report. Essentially what it says is that this, and this is across many developing countries, these changes where you see a rise in the jobs that require non-routine skills and a decline in jobs that require more routine skills. In most countries, we see it. Not everywhere, and one particular exception is, say, China, for which there is, explanation, of course, related to trade. This is a graph I like a lot. It came out in a paper recently of David Deming. So one thing that we are also learning, this is from the US, is that whatever changes are happening in the labor market in terms of demand seems to be favoring the complementarity between the non-routine cognitive and the non-routine social or socio-emotional skills. And to understand this graph, unfortunately, my slides are totally screwed, I think. Something is happening with the PowerPoint. But so the green essentially are occupations that are on the rise. Their share in employment is going up in the US over time. And of course, if you're in the right-hand quadrant, that means that these are occupations that are intensive on both social and cognitive, in this case, proxy by intensity use of math skills. The ones that are pink are the ones that are going down, so are either non-intensive on one of the two, or the gray ones are the ones that are staying the same. So, we had a conversation as part of the World Development Report with David Outdoor, and we asked one very basic question. We said, based on your research, what is your main, the main policy implication you would, you would tell governments in terms of, the research? And he said, very simple, invest and develop skills that are complementary to robots. So, and I think in this sense, this graph suggests that. Now, it's not all about technology, it has been said before. There are other forces happening, and in fact, some of these other forces, megatrends, actually go in the direction of, maybe explaining why these skills are more important. And the whole question of trade and outsourcing, or the so-called now trading task literature. So basically what it says is that, you more and more, because you're fragmenting the production process and you have people working in different places around the same product, you need more self-directed workers. This is just a graph of how the Airbus is produced in Europe. It's spread around 7 countries. An interesting thing is that even, there's some change happening in terms of the new products associated to the digital technologies. So when you think about the iPhone, actually, there's only 2 countries involved in the production of the iPhone, the US and China, roughly speaking. And there is no manufacturing worker involved in the US, because everything in the US is about the design of the product. The assembly happens elsewhere. So I think this is an interesting contrast, too, in terms of what may be happening in the future in terms of the demand, changes in the demand for skills. The final force, which, is not as relevant for say countries like Poland, but it's very relevant for many countries in the developing world, certainly in Africa, is urbanization. And again, there was a recent study done for the US, taking a very long-term perspective with data from the early 1900s, as much as you can believe that we have good data for that. This graph, and I suggest you to look at the paper, suggests that urbanization itself is increasing the demand for these sort of social skills, because now you have people coming together and there's more interactions, right? When you were in rural areas, people were a little bit more isolated. Certainly production didn't require so much interaction, but the rise in services certainly associated with urbanization suggests that this is another force driving the demand for these social skills. Okay, that's the second part, and that's the why. Why it may be that these skills may be important. So the question is, what can we do about it? And of course, if you have read or heard of the work of Jim Heckman, a lot of the literature is about investing early, investing in early childhood development. And there's a lot of truth to that, but again, when you talk to psychologists, they get annoyed because they say, not everything happens or should happen in the 0 to 5 years. This is a table from a paper of a colleague of ours, Wendy Cunningham, with a couple of psychologists. So what they do is they survey the literature from neuroscience, educational psychology, social psychology, in terms of what are the optimal periods in which different skills can be developed. Because a person either, the neurology of the brain is ready, or sort of children are ready. So socialization favors. And just to give you an example, say something like what is it? Not confidence. The one I like is, achievement motivation. Well, it's actually, you cannot really teach kids very early on this. If you have kids, getting kids to be motivated very early on is an impossible task. And there's a reason for that. It's neurological. There are periods in which you can invest optimally, but then you need reinforcement. This is what the R means. But there are other periods in which you actually is optimal to intervene later on. So it's not the case that it's all about early childhood. Oh, God. The other thing we know from personality psychology is that personality traits do change over the life cycle. And this is just a graph from research by Brent Roberts. They have followed people over time, so with longitudinal panels, and they have looked at how the big five change. I mean, these are the same people. And what is interesting is that, things like conscientiousness, we all become more conscientious. We all become more emotionally stable, which is a great thing also. We become relatively more agreeable. We become a little bit more open to experience, but then plateau, which I guess some of us can relate to. Interesting, look at the points of inflection when these big changes happen have to do with youth, the sort of youth ages. And they talk a lot about the fact that this is the time when people, get married, settle, etc. So there's socially reasons why you need to get along with others, certainly with your spouse, and you need to, become more settled and conscientious. So again, this just goes to suggest that this idea that, you have a certain window and is early on is actually not quite the case. I'm going to go through this very quickly. Just give you an example. There are different ways to think about the interventions to develop these skills, and we can think of them in terms of 3 categories. So there's the sort of school-wide approaches, which essentially have to do with systemic reforms in the education system. Changes in the curricula, learning standards, how you measure these skills. There are states in the US which are actually trying to measure systematically these skills. Then there's the standalone interventions, which are just essentially interventions to develop a specific skill. I don't know if you've heard of, very famous mindset interventions. I'll give you an example of those, grit, and so forth. And then there are the sort of outside of the education system interventions. So, you know, programs to train youth, which, for example, in Latin America, there are several like that, which has specific components on teaching socio-emotional skills. And then I'm going to give you very quickly examples. So, I don't, how much time do I have? I'm out. Okay, so I'll take 2 minutes, very quickly. So, the point that I would like to make is that, you know, a lot of times there's a lot of questions of, okay, can we actually do something about it? And I think that reveals, you know, a lot of our ignorance, I think, in economics about the literature in psychology. There's actually quite a lot of studies. They usually are small scale, that's the only problem. But there are quite a lot of studies that, at least in terms of proof of concept, suggest that many of these skills are malleable. This is one example of these mindset interventions. And there have been several studies like this, where essentially teaching kids that the brain is a muscle and that you can exercise it and become better essentially leads to improvements in grades. Same thing, teaching kids how to be more self-regulated. In the US, again, several studies have shown that has led to improvement in grades, attendance. It's not just US. Now we're seeing these studies in other countries. In Turkey, this is a very recent study done teaching grit in Istanbul, and it found impacts on the percentage of kids that achieve high grades, and significant impacts. We're actually doing an intervention in Macedonia about teaching grit with Angela Duckworth. I can tell you a bit more about that, but it's following a specific curriculum to do this with middle school kids, and we're doing an RCT evaluation. And then there are these programs, you know, these sort of so-called jóvenes programs. The most, I guess, well-known is the program in the Dominican Republic, which has a specific module on socio-emotional skills, and the evaluations, which are based on an RCT, suggest that it is really the module on socio-emotional skills that tend to have the largest impacts on labor market outcomes. And a recent evaluation was conducted, sort of tracking graduates 6-7 years, and there are very significant impacts on employment in the formal sector and earnings. I'll skip this. Now, how about adults? For those of us who are sort of older, there's hope. We know much less about this, it's true, but I mean, there are some studies suggesting that some interventions can actually improve some of these traits. For example, changing openness to experience among older people. We're doing an experiment in Turkey with job seekers, both youth and adults, applying this idea of self-regulation strategies. Interested, I can tell you more about it. And then I conclude with this. So, I think, you know, just 3 messages. The first is that, you know, these skills, we can measure them with a lot of complex issues involved, but we can measure them. Second, I mean, there are secular trends in the labor market that explain why it may be the case that we're all of a sudden talking more and more about these skills. Technology is one, digital technology, but it's not the only one. Third, there are interventions, sort of at least proof of concept interventions that they can be developed at school or outside the education system, but there's a lot that we don't know. I mean, we don't know a lot about scalability of the interventions, even, you know, issues of those, like how intensive they should be, for how long do you need, boosters. A lot of these interventions on mindset tend to be very short-term. We don't know if the impacts last over time. And there is a question on how we can mainstream them into existing structures, certainly in the education system. I'll leave it there.